So now let's talk about the cerebrum. So the most superior part of the brain contains the cerebrum. It's divided into two hemispheres. So here we see we have a left and a right hemisphere of the cerebrum. Each of those is then divided into 4 different lobes. So we call them lobes. So it's divided into lobes. We have our frontal lobe, our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe, and our temporal lobe. Here we can see our frontal lobe and our parietal lobe. Here we're looking at from the front, so we just see that frontal and we see a little bit of the temporal on the side. We're going to go through and define each of those lobes in a second. Now what you'll notice on here is that the cerebrum kind of has all of these ridges. We call these ridges that we see, so all of these kind of ridges like that right there. Actually, let me point out one that's like one that we actually define often. So like right here, we see this ridge right here. Those are called our gyruses. So our gyri are gyruses. Those are my ridges. And then where I drew the black lines, which is where we have our groove downward, those are known as our sulci. So the one that I just drew right there, that is our central sulcus. That goes right here. And that central sulcus is what separates my frontal lobe from my parietal lobe. We have 2 important gyri on either side of the central sulcus that we'll talk about in a second. But the one in the frontal lobe is the pre-central gyrus. That makes sense, right? It's in front of the central gyrus. And the one behind the central sulcus is the post-central gyrus because it is behind the central sulcus. Those are the only 2 sulcuses, that's the only sulcus and the only 2 gyri that I require you to know for lab. We have our pre-central gyrus, our post-central gyrus, and our central sulcus. You can see that central sulcus right here as well. And again, we have our pre-central gyrus here and our post-central here. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. So let's talk about our different lobes. So there are 4 main lobes of the cerebrum. The first one that we're going to talk about is our frontal lobe. So let me just color in where we find our frontal lobe. I'm going to do the frontal lobe in pink. Why? Because I decided to. So here is my frontal lobe. You have this same sketch of the brain for yourself. So if you wanted to color yours in, you're welcome to, or if you just want to label it, you're welcome to do it that way. Use this kind of for you, whatever's best for you. Just make sure that you at least label where it is on the brain. Okay, so there is my frontal lobe. Now there are a lot of different things that the frontal lobe does, but we're going to talk about some of the main key functions of the frontal lobe. When I think frontal lobe, when I think the front of anything, I'm thinking motor. So the frontal lobe is really responsible for a lot of our motor actions. That pre-central gyrus that I talked about a second ago, that is going to be the location that we find our primary motor cortex. You guys look at that chart above your picture. It says the primary motor cortex. The location of that is in the precentral gyrus within the frontal lobe. And the function of the primary motor cortex, that is where we think about movement. So when I was talking about the football from my introduction, right, and he's going to go throw the football, sensory information comes up, the motor information to throw the ball comes down from my primary motor cortex. So that's what we're seeing there. There are some other areas within here. We have our prefrontal cortex. We have a couple of other different cortexes within this. You guys are not responsible for that for lab. Primary motor cortex is the only functional area of the frontal lobe that you are responsible for. The thing I do want to talk about with my frontal lobe, besides motor, is this is also where I make decisions. This is the type of decision making of what kind of person am I going to be? Am I going to make this decision or that decision? It's within the prefrontal cortex that we have a lot of our personality come about. And it is also where dopamine is released a lot of the time when we have a reward system. So our reward systems that happen within our brain is happening in that frontal lobe. When someone drinks alcohol, alcohol impacts the frontal lobe, specifically the prefrontal cortex. So it impacts this kind of front area. They're showing also that vaping can impact that prefrontal area. Now, the issue with that is why when you are drunk, you do not behave or make decisions like you would if you were sober. The other thing with that is that can increase your risk of some other things like aphasia. Aphasia is where you are kind of unable to form words. So if you've ever had slurred speech when you've had alcohol, that is because on the left side of your brain, this is me going a little farther in depth. You don't need to know this, but I just want you to have an idea of this. Right here, around this area on the left side of your brain, so this is not on both lobes, this are both hemispheres, only on the left side of your brain. For 99% of people, 1% have it on the right side. You have an area called Broca's area. And Broca's area is where we have motor for vocabulary or motor for speech. And like I said, alcohol goes at this area. And we can see a lot of the time individuals who drink a lot all of a sudden cannot form words very well. And that is where they're having an issue to their Broca's area on their left side of their brain. So that's a little extra. Don't worry too much about that. But the precentral gyrus, primary motor cortex. Frontal lobe, think motor, decision making. Let's go behind the frontal lobe into our parietal lobe. Let's color the parietal lobe in green. So it starts behind that central sulcus, and it travels all the way back to about here, where it meets up with my occipital lobe. And this is my parietal lobe. My parietal lobe is going to be, when I think parietal, I'm thinking sensory information. When I think parietal lobe, I am thinking computing things. I'm thinking of, specifically on my left side of the brain, I'm thinking of mathematics and kind of creating problems and solving problems, as well as sensing information. The area that we sense information is my postcentral gyrus, and that is the home of my primary somatosensory cortex. So somatosensory sounds like a whole lot of stuff, but remember we called it the somatic nervous system. Somato means touch or feel or experience, kind of. Somatosensory. So this is where my touch, my feelings, things I see, all that information comes to this postcentral gyrus, which is within my parietal lobe. So on your chart, primary somatosensory, the location is the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe. Its function is going to be senses, touch, how things feel, pain and temperature, all that kind of things. That is what our somatosensory is touch and feelings like that. Not vision. Don't think of your senses like your five senses. We're not talking about smell. We're not talking about hearing. We're not talking about taste, but we're talking about all of our other tactile senses, as well as temperature and things like that. We're thinking of the primary somatosensory cortex. Behind my parietal lobe, we have whoops, we're going to skip temporal for a second. We have our occipital lobe, because we're just going to keep moving on back. Let's do that in purple. Right back here, I have my occipital lobe. We dedicate an entire lobe of our brain, a whole area of our brain, to vision. So way back there in our occipital lobe, this is going to be where we have vision. So our occipital lobe is all about vision. The primary visual cortex is found in the occipital lobe. It's crazy. That's where you can really tell that us as humans, we depend on vision, is one of our most used senses. We really depend on vision for balance, equilibrium, task management, moving. We are not nocturnal, so we have, like, when we're in darkness, a lot of our senses change. So vision is a huge thing for humans. And we'll talk more about vision in the future, but you'll get a lot more vision and special senses, not in lab, but you'll get special senses in lecture. Then we have our temporal lobe, which is right underneath. You guys should remember, oh yeah, that's where I had my temporal bone, right on the side of your head, and that's where I have my temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is, you can see, kind of has these 3 stacked gyruses, and they're literally named superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, inferior temporal. So they're kind of named by where they're located too, so that's kind of nice. But you guys don't need to know the gyri names. So there is my temporal lobe. My temporal lobe does a whole bunch of stuff. Some of the main things that the temporal lobe is involved in is our hearing. So I think a lot about hearing. If we go deeper into our temporal lobe, we get some of our other senses like hearing. We get some smell stuff that's going to happen in the temporal lobe. We're going to talk about hunger in the temporal lobe. There's just a bunch of different things in the temporal lobe, but the main ones I want you to think of is hearing and smell. But really, more so hearing, because this is the area that I find my primary auditory cortex. And think about it. Our external acoustic meatus in our skull, whoa, I'm going back to like the 3rd lab. Okay, so in our skull, we had the external acoustic meatus. That was one of our bony markings. That was within the temporal lobe. That is going to be where my ear is, where my ear canal goes into my skull. And think about that. That's going to go straight. It literally goes straight to my temporal lobe. Not exactly. It goes to a couple of different other places in the brain first before it goes to temporal lobe. But it's in that same general region. And those are my 4 different lobes of the brain. We're now going to talk about how we get supplies. So I talked about that CSF when I talked about ependymal cells. We're going to talk about what ventricles are and how they're going to supply that nutrients, where they're located and how they're going to supply nutrients to all of these lobes as well as the other structures within the brain.